speakers, who I would now invite to join me here on stage so that everyone can pose questions. Please use the Q&A, a tool that you find in the middle of the menu bar at the bottom of the screen, to pose your questions. And I will be happy to pass them on to the two speakers. Flor is already here. Hi, Flor. And Nacho, hi.
Hi.
So we have 14 listeners, and the Q&A section is open. We're waiting for your questions. And so thank you for your talk. It must have been also a challenge to put that together, because you two didn't really meet in person, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So thanks for the great talk and preparing that. I'm pretty sure that there are quite a few questions that the people have. I've seen a few names up there that I know you know personally. Nandita is among the listeners. We'll see who else is there. Okay, let's see. I have a first question that I would like to read to you. Like what has been stated by Paul Virilio, fear is also related to speed, which can be imagined as apocalypse or market crash. In the middle of what you've been said before, the shortening of time, how we should face the sense of lack of times to make solidarity possible.
How do we make sense of the acceleration of time in order to make solidarity possible?
Yeah, how we should face the sense of lack of times to make solidarity possible, yes.
Yeah, that's...
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Because,
I mean,
for example, when the applause is happening at 8 o'clock here in Madrid, it's not always a good time. Because we might be doing other things, like recording a video. So it's a good question, but
I guess that also with all this lockdown situation, people's priorities have changed largely, right? I mean, time in a way has come to a halt to some extent, and maybe we are kind of enjoying a more relaxing time, in the sense that we are having more time to do some other things instead of going to work, being trapped within the whirlwind of the accelerated time, going to shopping. All these things have gone, at least here in Spain. So in a sense, we have more time to think of other things that we couldn't do in the previous situation before the lockdown. And among these things, maybe solidarity has come as an urgent thing to do, especially in certain neighborhoods. And that's an important thing, because what is happening in Spain is that whereas in well-off neighborhoods, people are marching in streets, crying for freedom, in not so well-off neighborhoods, the solidarity networks are functioning quite well. So, yeah.
Yeah, like the baskets, like in Naples as well, here in the neighborhood, there were baskets hanging from the balconies, and there are notes of neighbors offering their help to those who are less mobile, the elderly. So these things popped up really, really fast after the lockdown started. Like the sense of solidarity was huge at the beginning of the lockdown. It was really clear that people were doing it not because they had to, but out of a sense of solidarity. And then all these different things that started popping up, like all the different people you talk to via the different media, and suddenly there's more time to do a meeting with the family or friends, or so there's many different things that started to happen. I don't know if some of you have seen this initiative of poetry going around via emails. So sending a poem to somebody that is in the network of the people who is sending you the email. So it's kind of a chain, but not of those that we used to know, like earlier on, like years ago, that were really like bothering change, but rather really constructive change of exchange of poetry, which would be like constructive towards each other. But yeah, it was like people took time to look for a poem to send somebody, and so there were all these minor ways of yeah, taking time to connect to other people.
Maybe because you were sort of heading towards the question that we have in line now, talking about poetry, the next question is, you are following an artistic approach to deal with the current situation, and thank you for that. Can you speak a little bit about the role of creativity in these times? To what extent is it important to do things differently?
I mean, I think that it's not only important and it's not even only necessary, it's that people have had to start doing things differently. And I think that precisely amidst the heat of the situation, new ideas has emerged as a result of being kind of immersed in a kind of different activities that didn't exist before the lockdown. So that's why we have put the here and now, the ongoing activities at the core of the imagination, because it's when you are seeing yourself doing different things, the different ideas can emerge. And I think that creativity in that sense is pretty much linked to ongoing activity. Yeah, I don't know if it's.
Yeah, and there's a kind of repetition in this this lockdown situation, where you also find like there's a lot of constraints, if you will, and you find like minor ways to kind of vary the routine or do something new, or I don't know, all these people that have started baking bread, all it was impossible to get like flour and ingredients for baking bread, and like manual labors. I mean, people of course started making their own masks, so all these different these little ways of kind of dealing with the situation that is so constraining, but then finding in different ways of doing it, and in that kind of being inventive and creative.
I guess it also links, right? Like the solidarity with creativity, because I very much liked I don't know if you know the rainbow action, where like especially children were asked to draw rainbows and put them in the window so that other children who would pass by could see them and sort of count them, how many they found. It was very popular, still is, here in the neighborhood I'm in. So that is also a thing that creatively created a sense of we're in this together. So
exactly.
I guess the two can be linked to also.
Yeah, definitely.
The next question is, from the point of view of discursive psychology, could you say that separation between present and future, as mentioned based in Randall, is a rhetorical strategy to justify not taking action now and to subvert political accountability? So by separating present and future.
I mean, yeah, in a way, politicians, I mean, of course, I guess that there are two different levels of analysis, right? From the discursive psychology, we could say that also, on the other hand, politicians are constantly promising different possible futures in political campaigns. And in that sense, that they should held accountable whether they are reaching these futures or not. Thing is that maybe we are kind of short-sighted when it comes to imagine the future, in the sense that, maybe some more scaring futures are put in the long term. So that's why we kind of cut off the present from this more long-term future, and therefore we are not taking responsibility of this future. And I think that this gap between the present and the future prevent us from like directing our actions towards whatever future scenario we might hold, so that we kind of feel comfortable within this kind of never-ending present, and hence this term of presentism, but not taking responsibility of potential damaging futures that we might have to face. But now we have been confronted with this grim scenario that all of a sudden has fallen upon us. So what to do now?
Mm-hmm. And I think also, particularly in the nationalist discourses of the politicians, there is a not taking responsibility for the future, because what they do is basically say that we have to go back to the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of recuperate, get Spain back, or take back control, or make America great again. This is like really kind of not taking responsibility discursively by focusing on this idealized national past or essence.
I also think that because some kind of futures, especially future dystopias, have traditionally been depicted in science fiction, and I don't know to what extent these futures are plausible to people. Now this pandemic has shown that they are more than plausible; they are real. So for people to get responsibility about these futures, I just to use Vygotsky's terms, these futures must fall within the zone of proximal development, so to speak, so that people start seeing these futures as plausible futures. And once these futures are seen as plausible, then some ways of scaffolding actions towards that futures could be possible. Otherwise, these futures would be completely cut off from how people perceive the ongoing present. So in a sense, this pandemic is kind of coming out from a science fiction novel and landed into reality. And now we suddenly realize that this utopian future is already here without time for us to imagine it. So that's a problem, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you referred already to the past, like maybe we go to the next question that includes memory. It says, what are your thoughts in relation to memory, imagination, and emotion in times of the pandemic and their relation to social or collective action? For example, the idea of no future that could be associated with a feeling of no hope and perhaps with the deactivation of collective action.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's
apathy.
I mean, I guess that in a way we can help imagining the future according to our own experiences from the past, or at least through kind of elaboration of these experiences. So memory here plays an important role, I guess. For instance, people started to talk about the so-called Spanish flu. For instance, people also started to talk about how financial crisis was handled in the past, so that the same mistakes are not going to be made again when it comes to economical recovery. So I do think that the past is important in a way.
It is also, it can also be very constraining, of course. Like the nationally framed imagination of the past can be very, very constraining in imagining the future. And it's exactly this framing which leads to your typical dystopias, right? In a more Orwellian sense. Or, but then, yeah, there's also other ways to remember that open up other ways to imagine the future. And so if you take different ways of looking at the past, I mean, I don't know, if you do women's history, then there is another future possible. If you do history which is more socioeconomic rather than national political history, there's another future that you can imagine. And then if you do global history or big history, and you consider like history as something starting way back with the Big Bang and needing all these different disciplines to kind of construct a memory, if you will, a global memory, then this also leads to other projections towards the future.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that apart from what has been said so far, there is also the so-called New Green Deal, which bears clear resonances from the Roosevelt New Deal. And for instance, in talking about the European particular context, I wonder to what extent, maybe you, Mike, can answer that. To what extent there is a sense of historical duty in Germany now that it's going to take the European presidency when it comes to reconstruct Europe after this pandemic? Because Germany was helped in the past after the Second World War, well, helped so to speak, but in a way we can say that, or during the reunification. Or not to mention the role of Germany during the Second World War. So to what extent there is this sense of historical duty taken from the past in Germany in the face of the European reconstruction? I don't know, I'm just speculating.
No, it is a good question, but I guess since I also see Nandita here in the list of speakers, I would I could say the same about Germany that she once said about India, that there is not one Germany, so there is not one opinion about this. So depending on who you ask, some would say like there's no such thing as responsible, that, you know, past is over and we should like focus on what is ahead of us. And then there are others who would state the opposite. So it is very much dependent on, I guess, also the personal background, the personal context, the background of where these people are coming from and what their goals are and what their imagination of the future is, where they want to go, whether they like sort of use the past to reach those goals, or whether they deny it to better reach the goals that are in the imaginative future. So it's not like, I would say there is not one voice coming out of Germany. No, there are many. So it's a hard question to answer. Maybe I take this to sort of give the word to Nandita, who wrote, looking at the events around you and the introductory piece on being non-European, do you think the citizens or immigrants divide has deepened, and why has this happened if it is the case?
Well, there was a really interesting piece I read the other day, which said that now that the coronavirus is on every newspaper, it's all about coronavirus, suddenly a lot of anti-immigrant discourses or news about migrants has disappeared. So there's a clear change in where the attention is being paid to. But then on the other hand, I mean, in a discourse of the Spanish right-wing party, it was clear that they associated migrants with the spreading of the virus, and they were complaining about migrants also flooding the hospitals in Spain, which according to them, of course, need to be available for Spaniards. So there's a lot of complexity going on there.
Yeah, I also think that this pandemic has laid bare that we are more dependent of people. I mean, we cannot be longer healthy persons if people around us have the disease. So there's no sense in making national distinctions when it comes to tackle this pandemic, and that's why, I mean, maybe from a mere selfish way, people are saying, okay, but also migrants should get involved in the national health system, because we have to make sure that everyone are okay, and there is no potential danger for people to transmit the virus. So, and for instance, on the other hand, there is a labor shortage in terms of people going to the fields and take the harvest. So they are turning to migrants to do that job. So this shows us how dependent we are, and how stupid it is to make distinctions in terms of nationality when it comes to face this pandemic.
Yeah, there was a piece I read also that argued that when we're applauding for healthcare workers, basically we're applauding for immigrants. So what Nacho just said, right, in terms of like the essential work in Europe, at least, a lot of essential work is done by people that have migrated from elsewhere, either within Europe or from outside of Europe. So by extension, when you're applauding for them. Which I thought was very nice. And then, of course, Portugal is setting nice examples nowadays, because they basically gave citizenship to everybody who was waiting, who was in the procedure, refugees who were in the procedure for residency in Portugal, and basically to make to respond better to the crisis, they were given residency so that they could make use of all public health facilities, so that, of course, the virus would not spread. So what Nacho says, right, it doesn't really make sense to keep on making these national divides. And also it's very telling when you look at how different governments have reacted to the virus, and in othering the virus or make it something foreign, they have taken really, really bad decisions that they must be regretting right now. So of course, for the virus, those borders do not exist.
But maybe still, like, this is what is coming up in the questions right now. We're sort of creating the other, or assigning like certain identities even to a virus. Like one comment says that the coronavirus was named the Chinese virus, like, which here is said to be a sign of micro-racism. And Nicholas is asking a question, what the role of the concrete other is in stabilizing imagined future possibilities for acting. So does it need like this other, the concrete other, to do so? Maybe.
Yeah, that's a good question, because actually in many countries, including Spain, this pandemic has been framed in national terms in a kind of a war effort against an alien enemy. Like it's kind of, people still need not only to frame something unfamiliar through something familiar, such as this narrative of a war, but also people need to picture another in order to be mobilized and Yeah, but on the other hand, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question actually, because in a way we do need to construct another in order to mobilize action to some extent. I don't know to what extent this is true, but on the other hand, this virus has shown us that it's not an alien enemy, but it forms part of the very nature, and we also form part of this very nature. So it's, I don't know if we could learn something from that, or we will need to stick to the same kind of narrative pattern, using again and again another in order to mobilize action. I think it's a very good question actually, and I mean, in that regard, the right wing seems to be much more mobilized than the left, precisely because they have found the other very quickly.
I think yeah, Agamben, the philosopher, said that using the war metaphor is not in any way weird in the current situation, but it would be kind of a civil war, because the virus will basically get into your body, right? So that it's a peculiar kind of metaphor to be using, and also kind of where is the other, right? It's this invisible enemy, but I think that it can go in different directions. The discourse, of course, it can be more nationalist, kind of can nationalize the virus or not. But it can also kind of unify human beings against the virus. So it can be taken in different directions depending on, yeah, what the political goal is.
Or maybe we should start othering not groups of people, but like certain economical systems that should be left behind. And that could be another strategy. I don't know. It's thinking aloud.
Maybe another question that would fit right there is with what you just said. How can your conceptual framework help with rendering away the vague imaginaries and intelligible to others and workable? And how relevant is art here? Can art be used to support this?
I think narratives can be used in different ways. So they can also be used in other ways. But what I like about art as a mediator is that it diversifies a lot more than the narrative does. It does not necessarily create this clear opposition of us versus them that a narrative can often do. And art, kind of, as we said earlier, can also connect to this solidarity and this shared humanity. And so it's really different. It's kind of the difference between poetry and prose, right? I mean, the narrative has also this clear moral orientation, which can be detrimental. Even like a good moral story can be detrimental in some kind of way for somebody. But then poetry is different, and opens up for possibilities and for perhaps also creatively dealing with what is happening. So yeah, I've been increasingly liking this aesthetic approach, as it kind of really opens up for different imaginaries, perhaps more different imaginaries than the narrative will allow.
The next one is sort of heading towards a different direction again. Nuria is actually beginning the question with bringing back the topic of history during the pandemic, and is referring to Madrid, where both of you are at the moment. She says that I can't help but to follow the protests in rich neighborhoods in Madrid and see how they're using the dictatorship discourse to criticize Sanchez's work. sign of intergenerational trauma and how to use it in discourse is a question here. What do you think?
Oh, this lead us to Spanish deep politics, and it's kind of traumatic. I mean, definitely, as in other countries, this virus is used for certain groups to push forward their own political agendas. And it's clear that here in Spain, they are using this virus to try to topple this current socialist government. I think that maybe because of the likely economic reforms that lay ahead of us, which will involve, among other things, to raise taxes in Madrid. People in Madrid, especially in well-off areas, are reacting this way. But interestingly enough, they are crying for freedom. Those waving the dictatorship signs and flags and crying for freedom and like putting things the other way around, like saying that our government is kind of a dictatorship, forcing people to stay at home and cutting their liberties. So yeah, I mean, they are also transforming in a creative way, maybe, the discourse, because they are kind of turning things around and crying for freedom, those who were defending the dictatorship.
Yeah, Nuria agrees here that that is very paradoxical. Okay. It's a difficult question, I guess, a topic we could discuss very long about with different perspectives. The next question, though, is I see a divide in most of the nations based on religion, socioeconomic status, geographical location, and many more such local factors. The psychology of these prejudices is intriguing me. What you feel with so much of experience exposure, like, does that play a role in your work? The psychology of prejudice and
yeah. I mean, yeah, I must say that at least in my case, I don't use so much this kind of psychology, and I have also to admit that at the beginning of this pandemic in Spain, I was quite optimistic in terms that I wasn't expecting whatsoever the far right or the right to gather strength. On the contrary, I thought that now that we are all together in this with this virus, national or racial prejudice will completely make no sense at all. But turns out to be completely different as I initially expected. So it's also funny to see how, at least in my case, my vision on the pandemic has evolved from being completely skeptic, also thinking that was going to happen in China, but people were too much alarmed here in Europe. And all of a sudden, one day, I realized that it was for real. And so my own taking on this pandemic has been changing throughout this time. And it came as a surprise to see how politicians are using this pandemic in order to push their own agendas, including this nationalist one. So
I think what might have what also my perception has really changed, like Nacho, kind of the same moment we were like, okay, this is really serious. So that's also the moment when both of us stopped othering the virus, if you will.
Maybe it's also not only about prejudices, but also just from my perspective, becoming aware of privileges and like advantages that one wasn't aware of before. For example, a student of ours does not hear very well, and she uses reading the lips to support her understanding of others. and current times, like where everyone is wearing face masks, she's pretty much cut off communication. And also, like, I have a job where I can work from home, and it's okay. Like, I don't have any economic drawbacks. Maybe the only drawback I have is I'm sitting too much, but that's pretty much it. I can like still make money, and we also have a lot of space for 3 people. Like, I'm not being stuck in a small apartment with 5 people, you know, even more like in small spaces. And all these things, I think, is more a matter of I think there was never a time where I was so much aware of privileges I had, because they in the normal flow, they're not really noticeable. So I guess it's like not only about prejudices, but also on the other side, like power relations in terms of privileges that people have and do not have.
Absolutely, yeah. So, absolutely agree.
So coming to the imagination of people's lives and things like that, I guess this is also adding experiences that might even help take perspectives in some ways. So can go in very different directions, I assume. I'm not sure if you agree.
Yeah, it has made me reflect a lot on well, feminism, and also like ecologic activism, right? So how this crisis has impacted. I mean, in the beginning, it was so clear that we all had to be like solidary and stay at home. But very soon, we were also talking about, but what about the women who are trapped in situations of domestic violence, which is getting a lot worse? And what about the children being abused, being trapped inside? And so this became a real issue. And then talking to friends who had to somehow manage homeschooling their kids with their jobs and so on. And so many tasks suddenly kind of falling on women again. Imagining at the beginning of the crisis, I had this reference in my head all the time of a mother, like a single mother, raising her kids by herself and working in hospitals and having to work here in Spain. What is she going to do? How is this going to be like? And so in everything I did, I was thinking about her because, and being aware of that, really my situation is one of privilege. And then the other thing that I kind of turned around about was the ecological reflection, right? Because at the beginning it was like, okay, so right now things are suddenly brought to a halt, and things are happening that did not happen with political decision making. So, but very soon, a lot of commentaries, a lot of pieces that appeared by experts as well have started noticing that actually this crisis might not be good for climate change as was thought in the beginning. So it really kind of, as it's been going on, things have been becoming way more complex than we perhaps started out imagining in the beginning. So I do recognize that in the beginning there was more optimism, more this feeling of solidarity than there is now.
And also maybe taking a more narrative perspective and talking about cross-national prejudice. In a way, these certain narratives about this pandemic are kind of taking some kind of moral lesson in terms of how good or bad countries have been in handling this pandemic. And for instance, here again, this narrative tap into many pre-existing prejudices, right? For instance, saying, no, the Southern European countries, you know how sloppy they are. They like to go in the street, so not being kind of self-disciplined, whereas other countries kind of brag about being more self-disciplined, more responsible. So there is a kind of national competition, like showing how good a country is in tackling this this coronavirus thing, and kind of taking moral lessons out of each national story, which in a way, yeah, I think it's reinforcing some prejudice that existed previous to this situation.
I guess also what doesn't help is that dealing with this crisis is something that is happening on the national level. So because there has not been cooperation and coordination on a supranational level, like Europe was really late in responding, and we all know how bad the Dutch have been behaving in that respect, as they did before, which is something that Nacho was already also referring to. But I think that that you give more potential to these prejudices when it's also clear that like the decisions are made on a national level. So this nation state suddenly becomes a really strong actor as well, which reinforces also this dividing up the world in nation states, and which of course is also a threat to Europe. The fact that the borders have been closed again, I mean,
No,
because this crisis has not been dealt with on a higher level than the nation state level, it really has been ushering in also of making possible the strengthening of these prejudices.
No, that's a good point.
Yeah. There are more questions. We just have 2 minutes left though, so I will read them and then invite you maybe to continue discussing in the Slack room that we provide for this conference. So that you do not forget, like the last question here is, first of all, thank you for your ideas. To tap into your theoretical framework, in the beginning you seemed to make an argument for placing the here and now at the heart of imagining. Can you elaborate on this and why it is important? And don't we rather need a more hybrid understanding of the actual potential in imagining as we move through time and space? For example, you also said that we experience ruptures due to the virus, but in such a rupture in reality not stemming from imagining, the implications of the outbreak in relation to wider and actual socio-technological conditions. So like this is also like there are quite a few topics that we would be able to address in the Slack room. I thank you very much for the discussion that we had here. And I'm very happy that at least in this case, we were able to bridge gaps between countries and actually come together for a joint discussion. And maybe even taking up on the idea that creativity and art can also foster solidarity between the different countries. But please, everyone, join us on Slack if you feel like continuing the discussion. And thank you for the talk of today. And well, hope to see you at different times with with other creative ideas. So thank you very much.
Thank you.